What's up, everybody? My name is Dimitri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Laurel Miller. Laurel currently serves as Director of International Crisis Group's Asia program, having previously served as Deputy and then Acting Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the U.S. State Department, among many other diplomatic postings over the years. She's a wealth of knowledge, and I came away from this discussion so much better informed about the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, the unique circumstances leading up to the collapse of the Afghan government, and the political and geopolitical implications of the reconstitution of a Taliban-led Afghanistan for the United States, its allies, as well as its competitors in the region. The first hour of our conversation is devoted to understanding what happened in that country over the last several weeks. Specifically, what were the contributing factors that led to the seemingly sudden collapse of the Afghan army and the evacuation of the capital by President Ghani and other members of the Afghan government? What were the facts on the ground leading up to the collapse? Who was aware of those facts? And why did the Biden White House and the U.S. State and Defense Departments fail so astonishingly in planning for this contingency? We also discussed the history of America's involvement in Afghanistan, if things could have turned out differently, and what could have been done differently in the context of what we knew then and the priorities and risks facing previous administrations going back to George W. Bush in 2001. The second half of our conversation is spent looking forward at not only the various scenarios for how Afghanistan's political and economic future is likely to play out under a Taliban regime, but also how the U.S.'s military withdrawal from Afghanistan changes the geopolitical chessboard for other regional players like Russia, China, Pakistan, India, and Iran, who have a complex set of competing security and commercial interests in Central Asia, along with an equally complex set of bilateral strategic relationships with Afghanistan's neighbors as well as with each other. We also discussed the political and diplomatic fallout stemming from how the Biden administration is perceived to have handled this withdrawal, its implications for the upcoming midterm and presidential elections in 2022 and 2024, and how all of this impacts America's strategic relationships with its allies, in particular its European partners like Germany and the UK, who played such an integral role in the mission to rebuild Afghanistan over the last several decades. This was a truly phenomenal conversation that helped me fill so many gaps in my own knowledge of the region. So without any further ado, please enjoy this week's episode with my guest, Laurel Miller. Laurel Miller, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me.
It's great having you on the podcast. So for our listeners, Laurel, who may not be familiar with you, I think many won't because most people don't really make Afghanistan their thing. It's not something that they focus on every day. What is your background, and in particular your relevant background as it pertains to Afghanistan and the U.S.'s war effort there?
Sure. Well, currently, I'm the director of the Asia program at an organization called the International Crisis Group, which is an organization that does policy research, analysis, and advocacy related to conflict resolution and conflict prevention. We're not an American organization. We're based in Brussels, but we're a global organization. And within the context of that role, Afghanistan is a high priority for us, and we have been engaged for a long period of time in doing field research in Afghanistan, analysis of the conflict there, and looking for ways to try to contribute to discussions about how to reduce the level of violence in the country. I also have some earlier background on Afghanistan from 2013 through 2017, middle of 2017. I was at the U.S. State Department as the deputy and then acting U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, in which I was a senior State Department official with responsibility for U.S. policy there. And I've also spent some time at another research organization called the RAND Corporation, where I did some research and analysis related to Afghanistan. I have an earlier background on conflict resolution and other conflict-related issues in the Balkans and elsewhere, have previously worked at the State Department and National Security Council and some other think tanks and research organizations. So that's me.
So you and I are recording this now on Monday, August 23rd. We're now more than a week into the takeover of Kabul and the broader country by the Taliban. What do we know about the events of the last several days, last week, and how they unfolded?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you have to separate that into what happened up until August 15th, when the Taliban entered Kabul, and what were the events that were leading up to that final collapse of the pre-existing Afghan government and security forces. And then there's the question of what has been happening since then. I think if we look at the recent developments leading up to the Afghan government's collapse, what we see is a series of events that were unleashed by the American military withdrawal from the country. Now, those aren't developments that were caused by the military withdrawal, because the government's first slow and then very fast collapse all resulted from a set of factors that have long been evident, a set of dynamics that were long in play. And so the military withdrawal didn't cause that, but it did precipitate the final collapse that we saw. And we can talk a little more, if you like, about what some of those factors and developments were. Then I guess I would add to that, there have been a lot of questions from those who do follow the situation there, and maybe even more so from those who haven't followed very closely what's happened in Afghanistan. Was this a surprise? Was the speed of the collapse, or even just the fact of the collapse, a surprise? And I think those questions have come up in part because, frankly, it did look like the Biden administration was caught off guard by the collapse and the speed with which it happened. My answer to that would be no, it wasn't a surprise, because it was a consequence of a number of factors on both sides of the equation: strengths that were building on the Taliban side and weaknesses that were deepening on the Afghan government side over a long period of time. And for those of us who have followed Afghanistan very closely in recent years, I think it was always evident that although rapid collapse was not necessarily the highest probability scenario, it was definitely a plausible scenario. So that's sort of the period leading up to the collapse. Since then, what we've seen is a growing crisis at the airport in Kabul, as an clearly unplanned for evacuation of foreigners and vulnerable Afghans has been underway, and a lot of catch up on trying to make that evacuation happen in the safest and most efficient way possible. We have seen the Taliban move into cities, including the capital city, where they have not been in the last 20 years, and we're seeing just the very beginning hints of what their rule in Afghanistan might look like. And we've seen a frankly surprisingly slow process on the Taliban leadership side of setting up what their new government is going to be and look like. They clearly were surprised by the speed of the final stage of collapse, because they didn't have a government in waiting. And so there's a lot to watch on these various fronts.
So many questions. That's a really great summary. So first, just to clarify something, when you say that this collapse should not have been a total surprise, in other words, it wasn't entirely unpredictable, maybe the probability was low, that speaks to, I think, something that has been bandied about in the media, which is that this was an intelligence failure. Would you take issue with that notion that this was an intelligence failure? In other words,
Right.
Did the Biden administration have the intelligence to be able to make an assessment of the likelihood of collapse such that contingency planning would have been the appropriate step to have taken?
hmm I do take issue with the idea that it was an intelligence failure for several reasons. One is that intelligence assessments are only probabilistic assessments. They are not predictions of the future. And therefore, even if the intelligence community had said, and I'm making up these numbers, that it's 80% likely that the government will hold on for some months or years and only 20% likely that there would be rapid collapse, those are just probabilities. They're not scientifically calculated numbers. And the issue is if you're going to do contingency planning for a variety of scenarios, you don't only plan for what you think is the most likely scenario or the preferred scenario. The point of contingency planning is you plan for the contingencies, which means even the less likely scenarios. I personally would have assigned far more than 20% likelihood to the risk of rapid collapse because for many years now, including when I was in government, we talked about rapid collapse, a downward spiral that is triggered by a crisis of confidence as the US pulls out as being a plausible scenario. And that was when the Taliban wasn't as strong as it is now. The other reason why I reject the idea of intelligence failure is I know how these kinds of assessments look. They're always caveated. They state assumptions. When it gets reported, when it gets leaked to and reported in the media, it's just a one-liner of they said it would take, 18 months or 2 years. It's like that's not what these kinds of assessments really look like. And then the final factor is, policymakers are supposed to use intelligence information and assessments as one source, one input to their decision making. Any policymaker who takes that as a direction that is the be all and end all of their policy decision making is, in my view, not really doing their job accurately. You can't be a well-informed, close reader of the New York Times over the course of many years in Afghanistan and not have known that there were some very deep problems and risks here, just to pick one example of how one person could be informed, much less talking to experts, talking to your diplomats, etc.
And having a daily brief.
Yeah, but I think sometimes people outside government think that intelligence information is some kind of magical information that is superior to all other forms of information and analysis. And it's not. It's important, it's valuable, but it is one input among a variety of inputs that decision makers should take into account.
Right. And it's ultimately the job of the president and the administration to make decisions with imperfect knowledge under an environment of uncertainty.
Exactly. And I think what the president did is just that. I think he decided, and his own words show this, I think he decided to take risk as to what the outcomes would be, because he very explicitly said, Afghanistan is no longer a high priority for us. We have other priorities.
So that's what I wanted to ask you, because the administration appears so flat-footed and so incompetent in this situation. And the question is, why? Is it because the president was not fully informed? Not necessarily because the intelligence wasn't made available to him, but because for some other reason? Or was he informed? Was this a risk he was willing to take? And if so, why? What do we know at this point? What kind of information is coming out of the Biden administration to inform us on what they were thinking about how they handled this? And even more importantly, I think for the time being, how they are adjusting to the situation to handle it going forward in order to stem this crisis.
Right. Well, I think here you have to separate the question of the decision itself to withdraw from the execution of the withdrawal.
Right, that's what I mean,
right?
To be clear, yes.
And on the decision itself, President Biden continues to very resolutely defend that decision in recent days, even with everything that we know now about what the consequences are. I have no question in my mind that the risks of withdrawal were understood, at least in broad brush, maybe not questions of, the timing of when certain things could happen. But for instance, even in the information that has been leaked about intelligence assessments, the assessments were, that the government was probably could hold out for some months, or maybe even a few months ago, they thought for a couple of years. It wasn't that they thought it could hold out forever.
Hmm.
So, what that means is that the president decided to pull out from Afghanistan, knowing that there was a probability that the government would not survive a Taliban advance over some period of time. And therefore, it was a decision to tolerate that as an outcome, even if the immediate effects are messier than may have been anticipated. So I don't think on the decision itself, it was a lack of information. I think that, and again, I think President Biden's own words point to this, including his history of viewpoint on Afghanistan policy. I think he was very eager to end the American military involvement in Afghanistan. He didn't think it was justified. He believed that the US had higher priorities in the world: competition with China, the COVID crisis, cybersecurity, climate. He specifically named these things as higher priorities that are the things that he wanted to devote his administration's attention to. And he didn't think the military deployment was justified any longer. And that, in fact, he thinks it hadn't been justified for at least 10 years. So I think that's, what is really behind the decision, not any particular information about the details of what would happen. On the execution itself, I have to say, I think there was just a failure of contingency planning. That it doesn't mean that there wasn't a plan on the shelf for evacuating the US Embassy. I'm sure there was, partly because there always is, but partly because they have said so in recent days. And we've seen that part of the evacuation happen as you would probably expect it to happen. But frankly, they just evidently did not plan to evacuate the known categories of Afghans who would be in desperate straits once things started to unravel.
So, was the expectation, do you think, by the Biden administration that in 18 months to 2 years, that even if the Taliban were to take Kabul, that extended timeline would give the government in Kabul currently, or the government in Kabul before a week ago, the political leverage to be able to negotiate some type of arrangement that would ultimately be better for the people that were living there? Was that the idea? Is that the benefit of waiting that long?
Well, I think there was, only the slimmest hope that after a US withdrawal that the erstwhile Afghan government would be able to negotiate some kind of political settlement with the Taliban. Efforts have been underway for a long time to try to get that going, but once the US announced its withdrawal, the already low probability of there being a negotiated political settlement was even lower. But yes, there was probably some slim hope.
Interesting. So the idea so what you're saying is that, and this is also based on Joe Biden's own words and interpreting those words, that the Biden administration ultimately felt that the Taliban was likely to take over the country at some point, and that we would find ourselves in this type of situation at some point. And really what it comes down to is, what could we have done to get the people that we wanted out of the country? But eventually, whether it was today or whether it was 2 years from now, we were likely going to see a Taliban-led Afghan government.
Yeah, the intelligence assessments that have been leaked to the press as a defense from the administration, as a defense against the accusation that they weren't prepared, that they were blindsided, most optimistically suggested that the existing Afghan government could hang on. Initially, it was thought for a couple of years, then it was thought for some months. And so what that means, again, this is the information leaked in defense of the we weren't caught off guard. It was just that it all happened too fast. But what that really means is that it was understood that it was likely to happen, that the
Hmm.
Afghan government would collapse and the Taliban would take control of the country after some protracted period of continued conflict among Afghan factions. And so that is why I say that the decision to withdraw was a decision to regret that outcome, but accept it as tolerable for American interests. And I suppose the thought was that if it takes that amount of time, the at-risk Afghans could sort of filter out in dribs and drabs, and that you wouldn't have to have the kind of massive
Right.
evacuation effort you've had now. What I'm saying is that they clearly didn't have a contingency plan for the massive evacuation in the event that the contingency happened, which is there was a much more rapid downward spiral.
Was failure always inevitable in Afghanistan? In other words, was the American occupation always going to lead to an American withdrawal under more or less negative circumstances? Or was there a period in time after 2001, 2002, where the US and Western allies really could have turned the tide in Afghanistan and created the conditions for a sustainable, quasi liberal, democratic society?
Well, I hate to focus on the idea of inevitability because nothing's really inevitable except for the laws of physics. And so the idea that nothing could have been different in Afghanistan over these last 20 years is, I think, problematic. You can point to some points in time where different decisions might have tipped the situation in a different direction. And we could talk about some of those, but even there, you're trying to predict a sort of alternative history that I think is problematic as well. The really fundamental issue in my mind is what the original decision was in going into Afghanistan in 2001. As the Biden administration has stressed, yes, it was about counterterrorism. It was about going after Al Qaeda and the perpetrators, the plotters and planners of 9/11. But the Bush administration also decided explicitly that it wasn't going to be enough simply to go after the perpetrators and take what they derided as the old law enforcement approach to counterterrorism, that wasn't big enough in the circumstances of 9/11, chasing the perpetrators, that they had to send a message to would-be harborers of terrorist groups around the world by toppling the Taliban regime that had harbored Osama bin Laden and refused to turn him over, and that there had to be punishment, therefore, of the Taliban, not only going after Al Qaeda. And so, this was a decision to implement regime change. It was a decision that Taliban rule of Afghanistan was intolerable, unlike the decision we've had recently that it's regrettable but tolerable.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot flowed from that decision to engage in regime change, including that once you do that, you can't simply leave a vacuum. Indeed, in the early years after the US toppled the Taliban, all of the criticism of what the US was doing was that it was doing too little nation building, not too much nation building.
Sure. There's actually a great speech that I actually watched before this conversation of Joe Biden at, I think at CSIS in 2002, where he said, quote, "History is going to judge us very harshly, I believe, if we allow the hope of a liberated Afghanistan to evaporate because we are fearful of the phrase nation building."
Yikes. Okay. It's interesting. I haven't seen that quote pulled up in recent days and weeks. You would think someone else would have grabbed
Well, it's really
onto
something,
that.
and I don't want to steer too far because I want to make sure that you can continue the points you made, but I do want to make this point because I think it's valuable, irrespective of whether you grew up or came of age during this war, because I did. I was a sophomore in college during the 9/11 attacks, but there are many people who maybe didn't live through that period. But it's important to understand it, either to revisit it and
Yes.
remind yourself of the optimism, both the fear in the body politic, but the optimism around American power and our capacity to project it for good in the world, and really compare that time to today and how
Right.
different the period is. I was actually reminded, it's not a perfect analogy, but Pericles' funeral oration at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War and a speech that he gave about 2 years into the war, shortly before he died of the plague. And what's remarkable is how unremarkable, how predictable this feels based on everything that so many analysts were saying at the time, that we would get bogged down in an endless war. This is the graveyard of empires. The Taliban were fighting us with weapons that they got from the Russians. And now they're going to fight whoever they're going to fight next with weapons they got from the United States. So I think it's instructive to look at our leaders, to compare Joe Biden in 2021 with Joe Biden in 2002 in order to understand the fallibility and the intractability of conflicts like this, and how oftentimes empires or hegemons get caught up in megalomaniacal visions and euphoria that doesn't really jive with the facts on the ground.
I think that's right, but I think you also have to evaluate decisions. You can't only evaluate it in hindsight if you really want to understand how to improve decision making. You
Hmm.
do have to look at why were decisions made the way they were made at the time? What were people actually thinking at the time? What information was available to them? And the quote that you read reflected what the general sentiment and debate was in Washington, unquestioned. I mean, Rumsfeld, the now much derided and I think justifiably so, Donald Rumsfeld, had the viewpoint that the US should have a quote unquote light footprint after invading Afghanistan. Go in, we change the regime, over to you, Afghans. We're just going to do a little bit around the edges. And oh, by the way, the UN and some other countries should sort of take the lead on all of these things.
He
And
wasn't very excited to go in. And he famously, I remember saying on 9/11 that there are no good targets in Afghanistan. We have to go after Iraq.
yeah, well, we learned a lot more about that later. But in any event, that idea of we just go in with a light footprint and exit was much criticized, in part for very good reasons, because we had just invaded the country because we thought the nature of the governance there created an environment that enabled terrorist groups to thrive. So what are you going to do? Just sort of absent yourself and hope that a different set of Afghans sort of sort things out all on their own with no resources, no institutions, no government, from a blank slate, and they're going to set up something that's going to protect US interests going forward? I mean, that was a kind of unthinkable idea at the moment. And frankly, I think you'd be hard pressed to say it would have worked much better if the U.S. just left in the first couple of years before the Taliban insurgency really took full force and they regrouped as an insurgency. So, but I mean, the point I was making earlier was that you go in, you engage in regime change, you then have to clean up the situation, or you are going to be seen, and you would be rightly accused of irresponsibly breaking the glass and not even sweeping it up, much less rebuilding, restoring the windows. The difficulty then is that once you've now gone down the road of nation building, how do you make it a success? And that's where it becomes very problematic. And the expectations about what could be done, how quickly it could be done, how much money to flood into the country, how quickly, all became very problematic. And, there's plenty of lesson learning to be done about how to go about the nation building, though I don't think it's something that can be by any means perfected by outside powers like the US. But to say now in 2021, the US never should have done nation building in Afghanistan is to ignore that history of what was happening in 2001, 2002, when the US went down the road of regime change, which then necessitated nation building. So to say the US never should have done nation building in Afghanistan is to say the US should have left the Taliban regime in place, only gone after al-Qaeda, and, maybe occasionally pinprick punish the Taliban now and then if they misbehaved, violate the country's sovereignty to go after al-Qaeda, but it's a very radically different alternative history than anyone's talking about.
Right. All great points. Also, at the time, how would the United States have been able to intervene in Afghanistan in a moment's notice if it needed to? Would it have relied on Saudi Arabia, for example, understanding that that was a source of indignation on the part of Islamic extremists?
Yeah, I mean, the issue is more Pakistan. I mean, the US does also have bases
Right.
elsewhere in the Persian Gulf, in the United Emirates, and in Qatar, but the issue is more Pakistan, Afghanistan's next door neighbor. So the US, in those early days after 9/11, those early hours and days after 9/11, delivered an ultimatum to the Pakistani leadership. You are either with us or
Hmm.
against us. They went through the Pakistani leadership in their efforts to pressure the Taliban to turn over Osama bin Laden. If the Taliban had handed over Osama bin Laden, we really would have had a different history, because I don't think there would have been any invasion of the country. But the US and evidently Pakistan failed to persuade the Taliban to turn over bin Laden. The US then made clear to Pakistan its intentions to topple the Taliban regime. Pakistan very reluctantly said, okay, you're forcing us into this. We're with you or against you. We're with you, but. The but was, you can't exclude Taliban from whatever arrangements
Mm.
politically you set up in the future in Afghanistan. I mean, the Pakistanis signaled from the very first days that their viewpoint was that the Taliban had to be part of whatever political arrangement there would be in Afghanistan. No surprise then that over these many years, they have conducted a kind of two-sided strategy of, on the one hand, kind of working with the US on its war and peacemaking efforts, and on the other hand, never giving up their relationship with the Taliban and enabling them to regroup as an insurgency and eventually succeed as they have as an insurgency. So the US was able to access Afghanistan via Pakistan. If you're trying to write this alternative history of how it all goes down, you have to factor in, for how long would Pakistan have allowed the US access to Afghanistan if the US was doing things with which the Pakistanis disagreed. But, in this alternative vision where there's no invasion, the US is just doing the quote unquote law enforcement approach to counterterrorism, it's plausible that what the US would have been doing and asking of the Pakistanis would have been limited enough for them to be able to balance that with their other policy priorities, which were adverse to the US priorities.
It also speaks to something that I think was a common thread between both Iraq and Afghanistan. Because in Iraq, we also had a similar kind of de-Baathification that happened early on in the occupation, which experts point to as having been one of the very early failures that led to many of the other structural issues that emerged in Iraq. Would you say that that is also true in the case of Afghanistan, that the administration's insistence on de-Talibanization, so to speak, of not bringing the Taliban into a larger political negotiation, that was a fundamental mistake in
Mhm.
retrospect?
Yeah, and it's a similar phenomenon with some differences for context. So I think in the Afghanistan case, what you saw was, in that early period, the Bush administration's attitude was, Taliban? What Taliban? We just utterly defeated them. There are no
Hmm.
Taliban. Why do the other Afghans need to reach any political accommodations with them? We're not interested in that. And more to the point, we don't need to be interested in that because there is no more Taliban. We have utterly defeated them. So that was a combination of kind of hubristic attitude about how definitively the US had solved a problem like Afghanistan, but also just a lack of fundamental understanding of the context, and also a lack of understanding of a lack of listening to what Pakistan was saying and understanding what that was going to mean for how Pakistan was going to behave.
Well, I want to have a question about that specifically. Just to be clear, what you're saying is, again, this was not an intelligence failure in 2001, 2002. It wasn't that the information wasn't there. It's that the Bush administration wasn't really listening to it. And again, does that speak to the psychology of the time, the optimism about what we were able to do with our military and the force of our reputation in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think a combination of exaggerated perception of what American military power can achieve in far-flung parts of the world. But also, if you go back to 2001, I mean, how many Americans, either in the intelligence community or in the expert community or academic community, knew anything about
Mm,
Afghanistan? You're talking about a really small number of people. It was a very closed government. It was a pariah state. There had been some American diplomats who had had some contact with the Taliban before 9/11. I mean, because there were efforts actually before 9/11 to try to get the Taliban to turn over bin Laden to the United States. So it's not that there was zero contact, but I don't know that I would call it an intelligence failure as much as, a lot of gaps and blind spots in understanding, but also a big blind spot in even comprehending that there was something there to
right.
understand.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. The Bush administration's entire cabinet was filled with Cold Warriors, and his NSA, Condi Rice, was fluent in Russian. She was a Russian expert, a student of the Cold War and of Russia. So that's also a great point. This was the very beginning of a shift in American foreign policy away from great power conflict towards something that was much more insurgent based. Even though I guess we had to deal with those kind of conflicts during the 1990s,
Hmm.
but certainly like the focus on the Middle East and Central Asia expanded dramatically during those first 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the Afghanistan invasion and then the Iraq invasion in short order just, consumed vast quantities of American resources, policy attention,
Right.
everything. And so I think you could look at the period before that as one where the attitude was more, we've just won the Cold War.
Hmm.
I mean, not just, it was some years hence, but, perhaps by 2001, some of the more optimistic viewpoints on what winning the Cold War meant had already begun to fade. Nevertheless, I mean, in that, fervor for revenge and after 9/11, you can
Mm.
see why, even if you can't excuse it, why there would be a pretty blinkered approach to policymaking.
Hmm. So I have another question, Laurel, which has to do with a perennial problem, I think, that exists, not just with the US, but centuries with countries and empires, which is the public perception of the conflict of the war and how it's actually going. What do you think the public's perception of how Afghanistan was going was, and how dramatically did that differ from the facts on the ground, and why is that the case?
Well, initially, it was celebrated as a big victory when the US did topple the Taliban quickly. And I remember that first visit of Afghan President Hamid Karzai to Washington, D.C. He spoke to a joint session of Congress. He was celebrated as this magnificent hero and partner with the United States. I mean, there was in that early few years, a very positive American, to the extent people were paying attention. And of course, I live in the Washington milieu, so it's, my views are colored a little bit
A lot of
by
people were
that. But
more people were though than that would have otherwise because of the fact that 9/11 was a terror attack that
right,
yeah.
right. But there was this very positive view for some years towards Afghanistan, interest in the culture of Afghanistan, this big visit by Hamid Karzai, standing ovation I don't know if there was literally a standing ovation, but probably a standing ovation in speaking to a joint session of Congress. Now we were suddenly interested in Afghan women who we didn't think twice about before 9/11, and how wonderful it is that we're freeing the women of Afghanistan, how good
Mm.
we can feel about ourselves for that. So that, there was a period of time where it was a good news story. And I think the popular views would have no doubt reflected that. Then the war started to go bad. Then around 2005, 2006, insurgency regrouping, gaining strength, US having suddenly to add forces to Afghanistan. This is even before
Mhm.
the famous Obama surge in Afghanistan. There were a couple of surges of US forces in the late Bush administration. Iraq going on at the same time, not going well.
Mm.
Afghanistan sort of swept up in that same story of now we're mired in conflicts. And by the time President Obama was running for office, the storyline was this is the forgotten war. Afghanistan was the good war. You, Bush administration, failed to pay it sufficient attention, so the good war started to go bad. And I think that
Mm.
storyline got a lot of play, and it led to the Obama administration promptly, when it came into office, deciding on a big surge of troops in Afghanistan to try to turn it around. And from there, it just never really got turned around. This is when you begin to see rising numbers of American casualties and a steady pace over time of the storyline growing. What are we still doing there? As this isn't going well as, I would say over this whole period of time I'm describing, a steady, decline in any interest on the part of Americans more broadly in what was going on in Afghanistan, to a point in some recent years where, you wondered what percentage of people still knew, we were still fighting a war there.
Was that the case, particularly in the last few years, because of how the costs of the war, not the financial costs, but the human costs, were shifted from Americans and American lives to Afghans and Afghan lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely some of it. And again, I mean, I haven't charted out the opinion polls on this over time, but
Sure.
to the extent I have seen them, you do see declining interest, awareness, and I'm sure that the decline in American casualties can be pointed to as part of that. It's also that decline in American casualties and number of troops in Afghanistan and costs associated with the war there is part of what has fed a narrative on the part of opponents of the withdrawal that, well, this was all sustainable. We didn't need to
Hmm.
pull out because there wasn't too much cost. Because, of course, people
Hmm.
who are saying that are only looking at the costs for Americans, not the costs for Afghans of the
Right.
ongoing conflict.
Right. Exactly. So let's bring it back to today. What seems to have happened, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that, I mean, the sudden collapse of Afghanistan is really another way of describing the political decisions and calculations that were made by stakeholders in the country to realign themselves with the Taliban in the face of the American withdrawal. The Taliban have been very successful within the country and as an insurgent group for many years. But they are now moving from the political identity of insurgency to governing authority. And that presents a lot of challenges for the Taliban that they are, I think, going to have to begin to face very quickly. What does that mean? Are they equipped to begin to govern the country? And this is also an opportunity, Laurel, to talk about something that I haven't really heard people discuss in the media, which is the Afghan economy
Hmm.
and what happens to the Afghan economy and its capacity to feed and support the population in the context of both an administration, a sort of Islamic State administration, and in the context of whatever sanctions may be applied by the United States and Western allies and the conflict that could ensue as well.
Hmm. Great question. So, a few threads there. I mean, first on collapse, yes, as you alluded to, there are two sides to the equation. One is Taliban effective strategy, consistent strategy that they've pursued over a long period of time, both military strategy, but also a political strategy of trying to peel away support from the government and co opt people, particularly at the local levels, as a way of paving the way for a return to power. Also, I would point out it's easier to be an insurgency than a counterinsurgency. So they had some natural advantages of insurgency on their side of the equation. And on the other side of the equation, deterioration of political cohesion, loyalty to the government, deterioration of systems within the Afghan security forces, so that it wasn't so much the fighters in the government security forces that failed the system. It was the system that failed the fighters, such that they weren't willing to continue
Can
fighting
you
for
draw
a
that
system.
distinction? Can you flesh that out a bit?
Sure. I mean, what I mean by the system failing them is soldiers not getting paid, not getting proper food,
How
not
long was
being
that going
properly
on
led.
for?
A long period of time, but it had been getting worse in recent years.
Why was that? Was that corruption? Was there something the United States could have done
Could
differently?
have done differently. I mean, the US tried so many different things in trying to build up the Afghan security forces. It was partly corruption, it was partly just poor leadership decision making at the top. In the last couple of years, that included constantly firing security ministers and leadership in the security forces so that there was an ever shifting cast of characters at the top. And that just eroded the ability, even of there to be a leadership that could exercise any
Hmm.
kind of real consistent strategy and authority. In terms of the systems, like getting food and ammunition and pay to the soldiers and police officers. There's a long story of difficulty in developing logistics systems, even aside from the corruption of just
Hmm.
developing proper systems in the Afghan security forces. Lots of different things the U.S. has tried there, none of which ultimately really stuck. And again, harder to be the government than the insurgents, in that the government has to be nominally everywhere to protecting all the territory, not picking and choosing, and also has to be a little more, transparent and in the open, and rather than just doing things in a kind of opaque and secretive way. And it's just more expensive to run a counterinsurgency than it is to run an insurgency. A lot of contributing factors, but the reality is that all of the things I'm describing were well known over a long period of time,
Hmm.
certainly by American officials, and long pointed to as problems that would have consequences, but exactly when those consequences would be
Hmm.
felt, hard to know. At the end of the day, I think, the political collapse, the inability of former President Ghani to really consolidate the support and loyalty of other political factions was particularly consequential. And all of this combined with the US withdrawal led to a crisis of confidence, loss of confidence on the part of the security forces and the political forces in Afghanistan, that the existing government and state system would be able to hold in the absence of that American backup. Even if the Americans weren't out there in the field fighting, which they weren't, there
Hmm.
was a perception and a reality that there was always the cavalry to call in. And once that phone call could no longer be made, there was a loss of confidence in the existing system to
Hmm.
really do it on its own. So, that's the kind of two sides of the coin of collapse. But I've already alluded to some of the factors that get to your second question about that shift from insurgency to governance
Hmm.
and what the challenges are. Because, as I said, it's easier to be an insurgency than it is to be a government. The Taliban has, in areas which are only rural areas, that they have gained control of steadily over the last 10 to 15 years, exercised what's referred to as shadow governance, where they would say, they didn't call it shadow governance, they purported that it was the legitimate governance, where there would be a Taliban, quote unquote, governor of a province or of a
Hmm.
district, which is a subset of a province. And, it's true that they had a kind of rudimentary system of government operating, but it was rudimentary. It provided very limited services, and it indeed co opted services that were actually provided by the government and non governmental organizations by negotiating permission for access for those services to be provided to the local populations without actually having any responsibility for managing and running that themselves. So it was a kind of clever strategy to
Hmm.
create an appearance and only partial reality of governing areas. But that's much different than what you can do now in cities and at a national scale. Some of their challenges, I mean, first, they've got the challenge of just what is the government they're going to set up? what kind of state is this going to be? A theocratic state,
Hmm.
a state with elections, a hybrid state like Iran, where there's kind of a theocratic element, pillar and a secular pillar that does have elections. I mean, they have not ever, even in all these years of trying to talk to them as foreigners and Afghans have tried to do about what might a political solution for Afghanistan look like, they've never shown what their thinking is on this. So that's one question for them as they make the transition. Another is that they have different kinds of constituencies to satisfy. They're fighters, they're commanders who are pretty hardline and extreme. They're more political elements. They're the foreign audience from whom they're hoping to get some financial support and legitimacy. And as you alluded to, a potential economic challenge, because the government that just fell in Afghanistan its budget was about 75% financed by foreign donors.
Right.
Afghanistan has never been in its modern history a self-sustaining economy and government. It has always depended in one way or another on external resources. That 75% that's gone right now. Maybe some of it will come back. Some of it will be converted into humanitarian assistance that goes directly to the Afghan people. The 25% of the government's budget that was domestically financed, a lot of that came from customs revenue, which the Taliban will now have access to. And it will continue to have access to revenue streams that they had to fund their insurgency. But what they have said is their ambition is not to be the kind of pariah, impoverished regime that they were in the 1990s, where they didn't have these kind of external resources. And so they ran, a rudimentary government on a shoestring. If they don't want to do that now, they've got some real problems to solve in terms of balancing what any foreign donors are going to want from them with what
Right.
their own constituencies want, and what even, the unknown questions as to what their leadership's even intentions would be, even absent pressures from inside the
Right.
group.
And I guess that raises a question of how practical is this government or the ruling elite within the Taliban? How committed are they to their ideology? And that speaks to something else, which is that you said that it's not clear to us how they plan to rule, but I wonder internally how clear it is to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think perhaps a promising indication to the point about practicality is how sensitive they are to foreign perception, at least at the current moment, and perhaps aware of the implications of running afoul of the international community, the economic fallout in particular,
Mm-hmm.
which would obviously make it much more difficult to run the country. Laurel, I'm going to move the second half of this conversation into the overtime. I want to ask you a bit more about the implications of all of this for the Afghan economy and government, what you think we're going to see, what the likelihoods are. And then I want to really pivot to a broader conversation about how this changes the politics and geopolitics of Central Asia and Asia, what the Biden administration's grander vision is, how it sees the withdrawal of Afghanistan fitting into that, what this means for China, Russia, and Iran. China in particular, given the growing importance that our relationship to China is having in terms of American geostrategic vision. And I also want to ask, in addition to how this is being perceived by our European allies, what the implications are for our relationship with the Europeans, if, the broader question about U.S. credibility, how merited is that, et cetera, to ask what you think the political fallout is domestically for this. Because what I've been seeing in the last week, besides the actual images in Afghanistan, is the campaign ads that are going to be running in 2022 and 2024 that are basically just going to pull content from all of what's happening in Afghanistan. And then the president's political opponents and the Democratic Party's political opponents are licking their chops at what's happening here. I mean, this is a boon for their political story. But we'll get into that in the overtime. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Laurel, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the Overtime feed to your phone so that you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Laurel, stick around. We're going to move the second half of our conversation into the subscriber overtime.
Great. Looking forward to it.
For more information about this week's episode of Hidden Forces, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.